Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board game expansions. Now, quite often when a board game is met with a certain level of success, the publishers will release additional content for it in the form of expansions. And these expansions usually will introduce additional content, components. Quite often they'll introduce new mechanisms, different ways of playing the game altogether, perhaps adding to the player count, different ways of enhancing the gaming experience and keeping it relevant to its particular target audience. Now, I myself must admit that I'm not as obsessive about expansions as some others in the hobby might be. There's tons of games that I can play hundreds of times without introducing an expansion to. However, there are some games that I do feel need the expansion content in order to contribute to its replayability and in order to complete the gaming experience. And that's exactly what this is about. It's about 10 essential board game expansions. These are not just expansions that add more content. These are expansions that to some extent complete the experience and keep the game replayable for me. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 essential board game expansion, and that is for Keyforge. And this is the original starter set designed by Richard Garfield. And for Keyforge, this two-player only tactical card game, I'm going to say that the essential expansion is not necessarily the spin-off starter sets, but instead it's going to be additional decks of cards, because the base starter set here comes with 2 decks of cards that are available to all starter sets of the same type, and 2 additional decks that are unique to the purchaser, to the consumer. And that's exactly the gimmick of this franchise here, the Keyforge. It's that every time you buy a deck, it's a completely unique deck. Yes, some of those cards might be in other decks, but the exact configuration are not, because what's happening is the game has several different factions, and each deck is comprised of 3 different factions. 3 different factions among the pool of factions are combined into one, and different cards from that individual factions pool are put into that particular deck. And the thing is, you want to have additional decks because that's kind of the gimmick, as I mentioned, of this game. The hype of this game is exploring these unique decks that are different from one another, but they are already game ready for you. And the excitement of purchasing a deck, seeing what's inside, and seeing what you can do with it. So I find that to be a must-have. You have to have a few additional decks in your collection in order to get the most from Keyforge. My number 10 essential board game expansion, Keyforge additional decks. Now we move on to my number 9 essential board game expansion, and that is for Cosmic Encounter. And as you'll see with most of the list, I actually don't have the boxes for the expansions, because most of these games, especially due to the essential nature of the expansions, I actually just get rid of the box and kind of consolidate everything into the base games box. And for Cosmic Encounter, I'm going to say that Cosmic Incursion, which is the first expansion, would be the go-to must-have essential expansion. I think that all of the 6 essential expansions are good to have, and you definitely need to have 1 expansion in your collection just to add a few new mechanisms and additional aliens to pick from. Now, no doubt, the aliens in the base game, there's 50 aliens in the base game, are more than enough, which is why this game only ranks number 9, although I really enjoy Cosmic Encounter. I have to admit that you can technically do without these expansions. However, one of the neat things that the Incursion expansion includes, on top of adding 10 or I think it's 20 new alien races for players to choose from, it also adds a 6th player. So you have the ships and the planet tiles for a 6th player, which I think is very crucial, because I believe that the 6th player count is actually the optimal player count for Cosmic Encounter. It allows lots of different dynamics. You can have 5 versus 1, 3 versus 3, 2 versus 2 versus 2, 3 versus 2 versus 1. So many different political situations that you can confront by adding that 6th player. So I think that that makes that expansion essential. On top of it all, this adds a reward deck. So when players are helping the defending active player as an ally. Typically speaking, they are incentivized to defend and help the defensive player by having this potential reward, which is they can actually regain ships that have died previously, or they can draw additional cards from the encounter deck to add to their current hand. However, with this reward deck, we have a new wrinkle that's introduced to the gameplay. Now, when players help a defending active player as an ally, instead of drawing cards from the main deck from the base game, instead, they can choose to draw cards from the reward deck. And these cards are very interesting, and they are very volatile, because actually sometimes the cards actually might be detrimental to the person who grabs it and owns it. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, there's some very interesting cards in this reward deck, and that absolutely incentivizes players even more so to defend or to help defending players, because quite often it can the balance can really be towards the offensive players. Everybody wants to score points and they want to conquer and defeat enemies, so they're always going to want to choose to align themselves with the offensive player. However, that incentive, the prospect of drawing cards, even the curiosity of seeing what reward cards you might draw, might further encourage a player to help the defending active player, which is why I think that it's an essential expansion for any owner and player of Cosmic Encounter. My number 9 essential board game expansion, Cosmic Encounter Incursion. My number 8 essential board game expansion is for Carcassone. In particular, the first 2 expansions released for Carcassone. Over the course of the years, Carcassone has released 10 major expansions, not to mention a few additional minor expansions and promo materials as well. But the first 2 expansions, the Inns and Cathedrals, and the Traders and Buildings expansions, are essential to keep this classic gateway game going. If you just have the base game, Carcassone can be very simplistic, feel very much like a children's game. But once you add those expansions, it adds a little bit of meat to the bone. First of all, the Inns and Cathedrals expansions adds additional tiles, the Cathedral and Inn tiles, that kind of introduce a game of press your luck. Because when you play down one of these tiles to either contribute to a city or to contribute to a road that you've already started working on, when you play these tiles down, basically you're committing yourself to having to complete and eventually close those particular features, whether it be the roads or whether it be the cities. Because if you don't, then you're going to score no points for those 2 features, the city and the road that you contributed to. However, if you are able to successfully score these particular features, you're going to score 3 points for every tile that makes up your city, as opposed to 2 points, which is the typical scoring for regular Carcassone. And with the roads, you're going to score 2 points for every tile that makes up your road, instead of the typical 1 point for every tile that makes up your road. So that's something to consider. You have that potential, the prospect of scoring additional points for these features. However, you stand to lose potentially all of those points, because if you do not complete them, you're not going to even get partial credit as you typically do in Carcassone. Now, besides those tiles, the additional meeples that are introduced in these expansions add to your pool of meeples. So now you have more choices to make when you place down a meeple. You have your Grande meeple, which is basically a 2-for-1 meeple. So that's something you want to place, particularly in cities when you're afraid of your opponents trying to come in and encroach on your territory and try to share those points with you, or even overtake you for those points. You put your Grande, and that represents 2 of your meeples. You also have your Builder meeple introduced in the Traders and Builders expansion, and that builder is really cool because whenever you put your builder in a particular feature, from that point forward, going forward, every time you put a tile that continues that particular feature without closing it, then the game is going to reward you by allowing you to draw another tile right then and there and placing it. So these are opportunities for players to get 2-for-1 bonuses each of their subsequent turns after placing down a builder. So I find those 2 particular meeples to be very helpful and add additional tactical and strategic options for the players. Really cool. My number 8 into Cathedrals and Traders and Builders. Now we move on to my number 7 essential board game expansion, and that is for Dice Town, in particular the Wild West expansion. Now Dice Town does have 2 other expansions. They are smaller in nature. Wild West was the biggest expansion, and basically what it does in Dice Town, this is a dice game where players are rolling dice in their cups, and they're rolling and locking one die at a time. There are ways of mitigating the dice rolling and the dice locking, but typically speaking, you're rolling dice, selecting one at a time, and at the end of a couple of re-rolls, players are going to show their hand of cards, and based on the different poker faces of the die that they rolled, they're going to get benefits along the different locations in the city. You've got your gold mine, your bank, your general store, your saloon, your sheriff's office, and your town hall. And each of these different locations are going to grant the winner a particular benefit. Now, the thing about Dice Town is that this game accommodates up to 5 players, and it can get really, really tight, vying for leads in each of these different locations. What the expansion does, not only does it add a 6th player to make it open to an additional person playing, but it adds an additional reward in each of the different locations. So now, going forward, even if you're not first in a particular location, you can be second and you can get this secondary reward. So that's really exciting, and it makes it a much more generous experience as players are committing rolling their dice and trying to win particular locations. They know that it's not necessarily for nothing, because even if they do not win in a particular location, if they can at least come in second, they'll at least have something to show for it. So I find that to be really neat. My number 7 essential board game expansion, Dice Town. And now we move on to my number 6. My number 6 essential board game expansion is for Dominion, the grandfather of the deck building games. And as I mentioned earlier with Keyforge, to some extent, getting any expansions can be helpful. However, in particular with Dominion, I'm going to recommend the Prosperity expansion or the Seaside expansion. Those expansions are very good expansions. The Prosperity expansion in particular adds an additional currency. It adds an additional victory point card that's even more valuable than the colony, or I guess this is the colony. It's more valuable than the province. And in this case here, not only do they introduce this more valuable currency, the platinum card, and the more valuable victory point card, the colony, it also introduces additional action cards that are also more costly, and some that are worth exactly 7 money. There was some situations in Dominion, the base game, where if you only had 7 money, it was unfortunate because there was nothing that cost 7. Maybe there might be something that cost 6 or 5, but you felt like you were throwing the additional money away. So that is really cool. There's some really neat cards that add and contribute to the generous feel of this game. Lots of additional treasure cards that players can play as kingdom cards that allow them to build and generate more money. And you're really feeling prosperous, as the title indicates, as you play this game. Really fun. My number 6 essential board game expansion, Dominion, in particular, Prosperity. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 absolute favorite, most essential board game expansions, starting with my number 5, which is for Marvel Legendary, in particular, Dark City. Now, Marvel Legendary, a deck building game, just like I mentioned with Dominion earlier. Basically, you need expansions for this game. You want to get at least one, ideally a couple. You don't necessarily have to be a completionist like me, but I'm going to recommend a big box expansion. There's lots of big box expansions and smaller box expansions. The big box expansions tend to be the more interesting between the two. And yes, they're a little bit more expensive, but they're going to add additional content. Now, I'm going to recommend Dark City in particular because not only is it a great theme with some great heroes from the X-Men, the X-Force, and also Marvel Knights, it has some really cool classic mastermind characters like Kingpin and Apocalypse. Not only that, but the mechanisms in this game is kind of like a next step from the base game. The base game, Marvel Legendary, very cool, very good in and of itself, but it is a little bit more basic. there's not too many keywords introduced. It's kind of like a gateway into the system itself. However, the expansions are going to add additional keywords with additional nuances, and the later expansions tend to be a little bit more complex, while the early expansions are a little bit more basic and interesting as far as the introduction of the new keywords. Now, not only do the new keywords add additional options for strategy and deck building choices that you're going to make throughout the course of the game, but I also like the inclusion of the specialized bystanders. If you only have the base game alone, you have these basic bystanders. And the bystanders actually end up being a pretty important part of the game because your villains and your masterminds are capturing them, and you could eventually recover them, and they grant you victory points. However, the victory points is only useful really if you're playing competitive or semi-cooperative with a MVP. If you're playing this game completely cooperatively, then those victory points are worthless. However, the specialized bystanders are not, because right then and there, whenever you defeat that villain and rescue that bystander, the specialized bystander is going to grant you a special action. Perhaps it might allow you to draw a card or heal a wound from your discard pile or KO a weak card from your current hand. Lots of potential abilities with these specialized bystanders that the subsequent expansions continue to introduce and add additional bystanders. But the first big chunk of the bystanders came from this here, the Dark City expansion, which is why I'm going to recommend it as the essential expansion from Marvel Legendary, and my number 5 essential expansion, Marvel Legendary Dark City. Now we move on to my number 4 essential expansion, and it's for Pandemic, the classic cooperative game where players are taking on the role of members of the CDC, traveling around the world, treating disease, and ultimately trying to cure these viruses. Now, Pandemic is a fun game. However, I will never play Pandemic base game again unless I'm introducing it to a new gamer who doesn't even have much experience with gaming, because at this point I only play it with the On the Brink expansion. Now, I do also play with the In the Lab expansion, but that's an expansion that I can play with or without. It's not always necessarily involved. However, I'm always playing with On the Brink, and the On the Brink, not only does it add the 5th potential player, or the rules for playing with 5 players as opposed to just 4, it adds additional characters, additional specialists that the players can choose from, but it also adds additional modules for playing the game. It introduces the one more epidemic card, which can rev up the difficulty of the game even further, but it also introduces the purple viruses, which is a very hard and challenging virus for players to account for. So now you have 5 viruses. It also has an additional module referred to as the virulent strain, and this strain is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, and it's keeping the specialists on their toes because the game becomes much less predictable than in typical Pandemic. And you can actually mix and match all of these modules, and if you want, probably play with multiple of them, creating for a very challenging experience. It even has a one versus all version of playing the game where one player takes on the role of a bioterrorist, and they're basically controlling the game and influencing where viruses spread and what have you. And I find that to even be an interesting module. I can do without the module, but the virulent strain and the purple virus and the 5th player and the additional epidemic card, these are must-haves from my collection, and not to mention some solo rules for playing solo. My number 4 essential board game expansion, Pandemic On the Brink. Now we move on to my number 3 essential expansion, and that is for Port Royal. And I've got the expansion here in the box. And Port Royal is a pirate-themed press your luck game where players are trying to draw cards and hopefully not bust by repeating and drawing cards of same color types. But this game is a fully cooperative game with no direction. You're kind of playing for fun. There's a little bit of strategy involved, don't get me wrong, but there is not that much direction. However, if you get the first of the 2 expansions that they have for this game, I do not know its name. I believe the box I bought had its title in German, but this expansion adds these contract cards. And these contract cards are so cool because, first of all, they're kind of like a direction. You're trying to aim to complete particular objectives. And you complete these objectives, you're going to be able to score additional victory points for them. Not only that, but these objectives introduce a new way of playing the game that makes the game fully cooperative if you choose to play that way. So now, not only can you play this game competitively, as in the base game, but you can also choose to play the game cooperatively as well. And I like to have that option available to me. My number 2 essential board game expansion, Port Royal. Now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 is Seven Wonders. And in particular, I'm going to say that the Leaders expansion, which was the first expansion introduced to the game, is my essential expansion. I feel that Cities is a close second. I haven't played the Armada expansion, but I have played the Babel expansion. And while I do enjoy both modules from the Tower of Babel expansion, or the Babel expansion, they are not even remotely close to being essential for me. These are expansions that I will sporadically introduce to the game here and there, but I can absolutely do without. Cities, I quite often, almost always play with them, but I could also see myself, push come to shove, not having to play with that. But the Leaders expansion, I have to. First of all, the Leaders add direction, kind of like I mentioned with Port Royal. It adds a certain direction. Early on in these games, whether it's Port Royal or Seven Wonders, you're building your civilization, but you're kind of just going with the flow. You're building cards. It's a pick and pass card drafting game, and you're going with whatever cards you have available. And then in future rounds 2 and 3, that's when the strategy really comes into play, where you're trying to build off what you already started. However, when you play with the Leaders expansion, you add an additional drafting round at the beginning of the game. So there's a 4th drafting round where you're drafting these leader cards, and you're going to draft 4 leader cards. You're only going to get to use 3 of these leaders at best, but you have 4 available to choose from. You're drafting these leaders, and these leaders are going to score you points for particular things. And these things all tie in with the different spheres of civilization, whether that be your marketing or your merchants, whether that be your science or your culture or your military. And basically, it gives you a sense of direction. So from the very beginning of the game, you're making decisions to align with the decisions you made earlier on during the Leaders phase based on the leaders you drafted. That way you can capitalize on those leaders and milk them for as many victory points as possible. So I really enjoy that element of the game. My number 2 essential board game expansion, Seven Wonders, in particular, Leaders. And now we move on to my number 1 essential board game expansion. And I did not rank these games based on how much I like the base game or the overall gaming experience. Instead, I ranked them by how essential I thought these expansions were. And my number 1 is Hero Realms. And the expansion that's absolutely necessary is not the Hero Packs, because you basically replace them with this one here, and that is the Ruin of Thandar. And the Ruin of Thandar basically introduces campaign play. First of all, it makes Hero Realms, which is a competitive game, player versus player, or player versus player versus player versus player. It makes this competitive game a fully cooperative experience, and also introduces a narrative and a campaign to the game where players are going to go quest by quest, leveling up their characters, adding additional cards to their decks, to their player areas, to their tableaus, that are going to basically represent the upgrades of their characters. Players are taking on the roles of different classes, whether it be clerics or fighters or wizards or rogues, and they're going on these adventures using the deck building mechanism, using the same concepts of Hero Realms of building attack value, but they're using that in order to defeat the enemies and ultimately whatever boss each scenario comes with. I find that to make this game so much more worthwhile. I like Hero Realms, but it wouldn't be nearly as high on my favorites list if it weren't for what Ruin of Thandar does for it. So that's why I have to say that this is an essential for me. I don't know if I'm ever going to play Hero Realms base game alone ever again. The Rune of Thandar is the way to go. I don't even mind repeating the campaign. That's how fun it is for me. And I definitely prefer playing it again than playing Hero Realms Vanilla. So I find it to be an absolute must. There is a part 2 to this campaign that came out recently. I do hope to get that sometime in the near future, but I'm still enjoying Rune of Thandar. And I hope that there's actually even more campaigns perhaps added to the franchise in years to come. My number 1 essential board game expansion, Hero Realms, the Rune of Thandar. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your number 1 essential board game expansion that you always play with and cannot do without. Also, comment down below and tell me which of these expansions you do not think is essential at all. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.